first thing I have to get out of the way is I have rewritten the intro several times. Not because I'm unhappy with what I've been writing, but because the way the video turned out and the answers the exploration gave me, I have either entirely undermined my premise or rendered it completely invalid. I will say, this did happen in the best way possible. My original hypothesis was something along the lines of, rather than men and women being more or less afraid of different things, they're afraid of the same things, but the reasons for this fear are different. That kind of sounds a little dumb and stupid to me now, after doing all of this, but because I don't want to make you sit here and listen to me realize that I was totally wrong, this is not going to be a research-style paper, and instead is going to be more of an analysis. This time, not of media, like I usually do, but of people's responses to media. The new thesis is going to be this. Often, men and women are considered to be more or less afraid of different things than each other. I would like to explore why people feel this way when discussing horror, and additionally, I think that both are afraid of the same thing, even if the reasons that are given seem to be different. I don't think there's any harm in acknowledging the differences between the experiences of men and women, or any other gender identity for that matter. A lot of your life comes from your parents, their personal intentions for you, and the role in society they work to prepare you for. These things are going to ultimately change you on a fundamental level. The majority of the preparation your parents are doing for you is going to be based on your gender or your gender identity and how they feel that will affect your life. But fear, I've learned, rarely cares to parse through those personal fundamentals. Fear and terror prey upon what is most basic to you. So while there will still be a semblance of gender dynamics touched on as we discuss today's spooky topic, the question being asked at the end of the video will be, what is, at its core, the experience that is most likely to make something scary in any scenario for any person? Jumping into the actual essay now, I want to give a bit of context for how I came about this idea to begin with. You may have heard before that all horror is women's horror. The concept that all horror in some way or another can be boiled down to a type of fear that is reflected in real life for women in a way that men either can't or do not experience. This essentially is saying that horror tropes like body horror, the stalker/slasher genre, or psychological horrors pull many of their identifying markers from what real-life women fear specifically, and so to be fully understood or properly terrifying, they must be viewed with this perspective in mind. Well, I think the sentiment holds a significant amount of water, and I do think you could make a fantastic argument about this and apply it to a majority of horror across all media, across all time. I don't think it's a hard, fast rule required to find something scary to put in your movie or game. The most commonly cited example for all horror is women's horror is body horror, specifically with parasitic body horror. There's the clear connection of the potentially traumatizing biological events of pregnancy for women. It implies that the classic body horror might be more terrifying to women than for men, just by that nature of being a woman and being reminded of those traumas. The idea of a parasitic entity growing unwanted inside of you would still be terrifying to men, even if they can't or haven't experienced pregnancy though. The fear of something taking you over knows no gender limitations. A woman could also not care about the potential physical horror and view pregnancy as something that's taking away individuality and identity, say by assigning you a social role of mother. If that's the true source of their fear, her horror no longer comes from that real-life counterpart. It comes from something no longer uniquely feminine. It might still be a real-life comparison, but one of just experiencing loss of self, which is universal. And although I didn't have a sample size appropriate for putting it into this essay, you can easily imagine how this would apply to someone who's gender non-conforming or who has transitioned entirely. And on that note, it's somewhat obvious at this point that I am not a man, but many people I know who enjoy games, and specifically horror games, are. I also happen to know a few women, believe it or not. So for this video, I constructed a short questionnaire and sent it out to 9 different people for responses, 10 including myself. The plan was to compare them to each other and what they describe as scary and why they find it that way. Ideally, we'd have some repeat games named by the participants on the table to dive a little bit deeper into when discussing these similarities and differences. I'll start with my own answers, then we'll consider the results of the first 4 questions as given by everybody else and try to figure out the truth from this small sample size. Is horror on a fundamental level different for men and women? And if it's not, what is it about certain horror that crosses the divide? And of course, the overall answer that we'll search for, what is it that makes a game scary? At the end of the questionnaire, I did ask each person an optional question of what they thought about the original topic of gender differences in horror and if they think it's a load of baloney or not. If you'd like to follow along or provide your own answers in the comments, I'll go over those questions now so we're all on the same page before we start. The original questions asked were full of whys and hows and please explains, so I'm going to summarize them and focus on what was mainly being asked here. The questions are the same though, so feel free to pause now so you can answer them in full down below if you plan on doing so. For audio-only listeners, I'm just going to give you the basics of what the questions were about, and then we'll move on and you can kind of understand what I'm getting at as we go over the answers. First question, name the scariest game you've ever played. Then, tell me why it was scary for you, and what about you or the game made it so scary. Second, do the same thing, but instead of a whole game, I'm looking for a standout singular section of something. Sometimes these come from a different game than the first response, sometimes they don't. The point is, I want details on exactly what someone finds the scariest in the moment, rather than as a whole concept. Third, basically the same as those first 2 questions, but I'm asking about a non-horror game. This question was just to figure out if there are elements of the horror games that are scary because of what they are alone, or due to the effects of surrounding atmosphere and expectation that what's happening is meant to be scary. Fourth, this section is just a group of reflection prompts, the intention of casting a final net to scoop up anything that may have been missed in the first 3 questions. You could probably tell that it's basically interrogating the same response out of the participants 3 times in a row, and then one more time in a really roundabout way for that 4th one. Why would I ask them like this instead of just one very straightforward question? Mostly because I don't want to bug my peers every 45 minutes for the clarification when most of them do have full-time jobs, schools, and their own careers they need to worry about, but also because you can't really expect people who aren't currently in creative writing classes to elaborate so deeply on this kind of stuff without me prompting them for that deep elaboration. Case in point being the varying mileage I got on some of the submissions. Most people literally just didn't have the time to dedicate hours meditating on them. Forcing people to answer these questions several times over but in a different way with different context ensured I'd be able to at least identify the repeating themes, even if any of them came back hastily written due to time constraint. I admit I was very lucky that everyone managed to properly answer the first 3 questions in full, and all but 2 people did get everything done, including the 5th bonus question, within about a week. Since all the questions were very getting to know you like and looking for repeated patterns to identify what scared individuals in particular, for my own response, I'm just gonna go very in-depth on that first question for you guys because I know what I'm looking for, I know what scares me, and I kind of know myself already. So with that being said, what is my scariest game? Why? And how specifically did it scare me? Is it a Silent Hill game? Maybe something more action-packed like Outlast? Lucky for us, it's actually a short little indie game that had its 15 minutes of fame in the Let's Play genre a couple years ago. In fact, not only are we lucky that it's so short and will be easy to talk about, I actually have footage of when I played it for the first time live on my Twitch channel. My scariest game is one by the name of Wrong Floor. The game is very very simple. You get in an elevator, which malfunctions, and ends up with you stuck in the basement of your apartment complex. You're on the wrong floor. Not just because it isn't the one you're meant to be on, but because something is very wrong on this level of the building. Soon enough, you figure out that it's not just something that's wrong, but someone. The entire experience is extraordinarily short for a horror game, lasting only about 15 minutes. Naturally, my inability to steel myself and press the W key and a multitude of moments waiting for scary music to stop swelling so I could stop clenching my butthole as tight as possible, anticipation for jump scares that never came, made the playthrough more like 30 to 45 minutes. True to Ichio's page though, when you cut all the non-action happening, the game does come out to only about 13 minutes. The reason this niche, seemingly random choice is my scariest game versus any of the other big and more well-known titles is pretty easy for me to answer. I mean, is it the best game I've ever played? No, it's not even close. But it's also not in the running for the worst, and the game doesn't have to be particularly good for it to be scary. In less than 15 minutes, this one manages to hit every single thing that scared me in quick succession. For one, it's dark as balls in this game. Tell me, can you see what's going on my screen right now? Because I could not either, and about half the game is like this the entire time. There's also this absolute unit casually strolling around the place while you butterfingers your way through the most bare bones puzzle imaginable, a single key code found on a sticky note, and finding a power box to turn back on and reset the elevator. There is tense loud music, sounds of things walking around behind you, the knowledge there's someone there but you don't know where they are. You find a dead body down here too, and I'm not here to judge, but that is gotta be one of the worst design choices I have ever seen for someone's living space. It doesn't help that due to a handy poster on the wall, this tall goblin-shaped man is certified as a maniac. You find the poster pretty quickly during gameplay, and he manages to sneak up on you immediately after you read it.
Maniac? Oh god!
The way the game flips so suddenly from you're in a creepy place with jump scares of a fake dude that's a ghost in a hallway to holy shit, the guy is real, he knows I'm here and he's been watching me the whole time is a very big poop your pants moment. Overall, why the game was so terrifying to me is summed up pretty well at the end with what I say myself.
Wow, that was good. The concept of the monster, significantly scarier than just the idea of being trapped. Much scarier.
And it's not just the fact that you're trapped, of course, that makes it so scary. I wouldn't be complaining about being trapped, say, inside the maid cafe at the local anime convention. It's much more about the fact that I'm trapped in a dark, scary place with a strange, scary man who is looking at me from around corners. The height of the experience is at the very end of the game, when you're finally about to make your escape. You fix and you're waiting to get in the elevator, and the guy is just looking at you. You don't know what he wants, you don't know what he's thinking, you don't know what he's trying to do. Then the handsaw comes out, and it's clear he's threatening to kill you, but the fact that he doesn't makes no sense. You do manage to get away, which is relieving, but it doesn't allow the fear to dissipate since the reason the maniac let you go is completely unknown. And now you're going back up to your apartment knowing that guy's down there. The elevator to get to your apartment works now, and he knows your face and is in the building where you live. So for me, thinking about everything I just described and how it made me feel, the scariest things were to be trapped in a place, specifically with a person with unknown intentions that are implicitly bad and no way of knowing when or if he will come back for me later. And because of that, my scariest game that I personally have managed to play by this point is this niche small developer title from Ichio. I'm sure plenty of people could name a bunch of well-made, full-length AAA gaming experiences that play heavily into this fear. I haven't played those yet, but feel free to sound off in the comments, because I might want to piss myself live on Twitch at some point in the next month, considering it is spooky season. Moving on to the answers of our participants, what's their scariest games? Why was it so scary to them? And throughout their answers, can I find any obvious gendered or non-gendered patterns between them? Most people answered with the icons. We have Silent Hill 2, Alien Isolation, and some Resident Evil games. There were other titles as well, such as Darkwood, Fear and Hunger, and Madison. The first thing we're going to focus on is just what's relatable to my own answer. BLUEPEEs, who chose Resident Evil 3, Books and CONZ, who chose Alien Isolation, and my brother Dane, who chose Darkwood. All of them cite similar themes to myself, such as an uncertain fate, in this case due to disease, the ever-looming threat of a stalker enemy, feeling ill-equipped or unprepared for the situation at hand, a heavy sense of desperation instilled through the gameplay or possibly story, being far from home or trapped somewhere away from your home, having nowhere to hide and an inescapable enemy, threats that are unseen or unknown until it's too late, limited vision mechanics making you feel more isolated, uncertain time limits or time limits that you're not aware of for important events, and being aware of just how little you actually know in the grand scheme of things. Even though not everything here lines up perfectly one-to-one with myself, I do find myself agreeing with these things being some of the scariest stuff a game could offer you. All of them reflecting a sense of simply being denied information about what's going on, or if you know what's going on, not giving you the ability to stop whatever's looming over you in the situation. There's a few additions to the answers that weren't present in my own experience, and I will mention them just for the sake of being thorough, such as dark expanses of space, lack of autosave features increasing stress during encounters because of progress lost threats, body horror, and a sense of loneliness being far away from home. While I would not put those things on my list of what's super duper the most scary, I do acknowledge the fact that they could be scary to some people and that many people probably would put them on their top list, and they do bother me, if even a little bit. Moving on, BISCO, Losty, and CONZ, who submitted 2 games for this first question, all decided Silent Hill 2 was their overall scariest game. The common thread here was expected if you played the game. The idea that your own trauma, your own guilt, manifests physically as a monster who is sent to hunt you down and torment you. The themes across all 3 that really overlapped were the realism, the representation of trauma as a monster, lending to the psychological impact of what it all really means. The idea that you are the reason for this created horrible space you're in. You're the reason these monsters exist due to your own action. A special mention to Losty at this point, who pointed out that because your own actions, your own guilt, and your own anxieties created the situation you're currently fighting through, and because the goal of the game is to fight through it, you feel complicit with what your character has done to end up in Silent Hill. A quick side note, I have not mentioned the submission from Salty by Design yet. It's only because while his game was unique, the reasons he gave for why it was the scariest overlap directly with the first group that I've talked about, so I just put the little tally with his taken into account along with theirs. There were 2 games that had answers totally unrelated from everybody else's: Resident Evil 7 and Fear and Hunger. Fear and Hunger was submitted by MUZE, who cites graphic character models and deaths as what scared him the most and made him the most uncomfortable. Things like the way the game forces extreme severe consequences, like making you crawl around on the floor while you bleed out, and having monsters do really not okay, messed up, nasty things to you in order to kill you. Leaning into the uncertain outcome style of scariest thing, the harsh punishments are usually for mistakes you aren't able to identify as mistakes until the punishment arrives, making you constantly on edge before each and every choice during the game. Resident Evil 7 was mentioned by FEESH, who really, her description of why it scared her is kind of just a list of adjectives about the environment. Disgusting, eerie, gross, rotting, unsafe, unclean, nasty, disgusting. She did say disgusting twice. I would contend that after hearing that list, a comfy, cozy place to hang is really not what comes to mind, so I understand where she's coming from. She also mentioned the realism of the setting, having grown up in a rural, swampy area herself. So far, based on our responses, it seems that whatever someone's already scared of, adding a realism modifier causes significant rise in spook value. Leading into our questions 2 through 4, all of them ask for more specifics to what fuels their terror, demanding singular situations as well as something that ideally happened despite the absence of that environmental horror influence, a scary part in a not scary game. Big spoiler, pretty much nobody figured there were personal reasons for why they felt afraid in these moments. I was really hoping I would be able to wring out an answer like that would lean into this gendered interpretation hypothesis, but alas, at this point we start to stray even further from it with all the comparisons being made. Not all hope is lost though, if that's what you were really looking forward to, because I do go back to it and discuss it when we get to that optional question 5. The complexity of the overlap between themes around the first 4 questions at this point is so profuse, I'm just gonna hit the highlights and notable response sections all at once. Many of the scariest sections involve not being able to trust what you see, but there was also a massive overlap in the lack of seeing in general. Salty, Losty, and Books, and FEESH all mentioned the ocean was frightening to them. FEESH is a little bit of an outlier in this though, because while she describes the same keynote scaring her in her non-scary experience, there was a difference that I found notable. We can see while she plays Echo the Dolphin recently on stream in the background what she's talking about. Firstly, the ocean is dark. It's foggy, it's expansive in a way that makes you feel small, and many areas in the game she's playing feature tight corridors that are easy to get trapped in, which results in drowning, because dolphins breathe air. Being trapped in a small, dark place is a fear that I absolutely relate to. And while FEESH does mention the scariness of the vastness of the ocean and the space around her, the lack of environment making it harder to see where threats are and how close they are to you, her description of drowning in a dark cave seemed to really be what left a truly fearful impression on her. Whereas, the description given by everybody else with the fear of the ocean was of something big that you can't see coming and swallowing you up as you sit inside a large, empty space alone. CONZ describes the dark bramble from Outer Wilds near identically to the way the others described the ocean. MUZE also had a mention of a big monster swallowing you up mid-air, forcing you to traverse its insides as one of his scary sections. It seems not just to be that you are powerless and weak, which is of course frightening, but that you are in this vast alien environment, both insignificant and unprepared for what is to come. As Salty put it, I have no idea what's down here and I cannot see it or swim faster than it. The reason that dichotomy interested me is because of the repetition of open spaces and expanses being scary to people, where I personally am far more terrified of small, confined spaces that offer significantly less options to avoid your threat. The more room I have to get away, the better. And well, again, FEESH is bothered by that open expanse. I related much more severely to her fear of drowning in a small little cave. Moving into more of these answers, the web just gets deeper and deeper. BLUEPEE puts in her second response that becoming a character and how immersive a game is what makes it more scary. Books also said something similar in his first answer, where he described the first-person view as lending to dread of an experience. And Dane describes the way Darkwood limits your view outside of the first person as emphasizing how little you can actually see. Despite the fact that this is in the third person, you are forced into that first-person experience through that limited vision, which is a different mechanic, but it does still force the experience of only being as aware and capable as the character that you are controlling. Another multi-mention between all of these responses was the way an introduction can set the tone for the whole experience. BLUEPEE quotes the desperation in Jill's voice in Resident Evil 3, and how that desperation stuck with her as she tried to make her way out of the city.
It was Raccoon City's last chance, and my last chance. My last escape.
Books describes entering the Ishimura in Dead Space, and the way the tension breaks with that fateful encounter, forcing you to run for your life. It becomes less about the moments in themselves, but again, the persistence of them. In the setting you're put in, the tone is made for the rest of the playtime. There's an underlying emotional state that heightens the rest of the experience as you come across it. I also had 3 mentions of redeads from N64 Zelda games. These boil down to scary monster, no explanation, it's stuns you and moans and screams. An expected reaction from people who cited being only around 10 years of age when they play these games. Once again, basically everybody at some point in these next 3 questions mentioned being unaware of their surroundings or unaware of the motivations of others. Things mentioned like BioShock's Fort Frolic area, where the splicers behave like weeping angels and break the lighting fixtures. Game mechanics that rely on temporary vision, like a camera flash being your only light. A ghost on the other side of the door threatening to come in, but you don't know what it wants. Not being able to see the bottom of a body of water you're sitting over. Someone or something being angry with you and you don't know why. Someone doing evil things, but without a clear reason or a clear motivation of why they're being evil. In my own scariest game, a feature that made everything 10 times worse was the way your flashlight would periodically falter and sputter out for a few moments. Just barely topping "it felt like" or "it was related to something real," this motif is by far the most common response on why people found something scary. Before transitioning into question 5, where everyone gave their opinion on whether or not they find gendered horror to be a legitimate concept, I want to go back to question 2, where I asked people if their horror situation scenario happened to have a personal fear component. BISCO is the only one who said maybe, instead of just flat out no to this question. Her scariest section was Abstract Daddy from Silent Hill 2. Now, she had the repeating motifs of being chased through hallways and unable to escape, but her answer here also made me feel like I could be cooking with that original hypothesis. She mentions that while that scenario might not be directly personal to her, it felt more personal than her other examples because, as someone who was a young girl at some point, she can easily imagine being in Angela's shoes and how horrific it would be to be in that situation. The reason this felt like I could be onto something with my idea of, even though the horror's the same, the reason it's scaring them is different, is because all of the men who mentioned Silent Hill 2 also answered that Angela was scary, it was a scary situation, but their idea of it was from an outside perspective and more passive. All of this as a whole, by the way, lends even more credence to that realism equals scary idea. The way there could be a realism modifier added on top of an already existing scary scenario that will heighten the scares depending on the person and how much they relate to the realism involved. Now that we've taken the time to identify the things that scare everybody and how they overlap and intersect, we need to move on to the final question and the analysis of what it all could mean. Question 5, again, was about the people participating's opinion on gender dynamics in gaming and horror and how that could affect someone's experience or the impact horror has on them. Now, outside of myself, there were 9 participants, but only 7 responded to question 5, as I did specify it was optional. Of the 7, there was only 1 response that disagreed entirely with the whole premise, deciding that initial reactions to something is what constitutes fear and horror and terror, and therefore anything that requires additional musings that come from your identity after the fact shouldn't count when we're deciding what the scariest game to play is or not. You're scared of what you're taught to be scared of as a baby, and that's it. At first, this answer was kind of no fun, but when I was reading back other submissions, I noticed that in Book's very first response, he said he wasn't afraid of games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil. He acknowledges they're psychologically thrilling and they're creepy, but he doesn't call them scary because he didn't feel they preyed on his basic fear of being powerless or not being able to contend with what's threatening him. CONZ had 2 different answers, one based on core gameplay and the other on story, which inherently did separate these 2 kinds of fears. So overall, I do consider that to be a valid conclusion from this outlier answer, rather than considering it to be dodging the question or anything like that. Fear is a core response, and a core response is animal and doesn't need to rely on your identity or experiences to be initially achieved. Outside of that response, there was consensus, essentially, that absolutely gender plays a part into what is scary and how scary it is. The amount it plays into it varies by response, but it is acknowledged or at least entertained maintained by everyone. Not because of nature though, but because of nurture. And I think they are correct. There were definitely reoccurring themes in women's writings versus the men's that didn't overlap at all. Going back to the realism modifier concept, being exposed to the idea that something could happen to you in real life is going to potentially make it scarier when it finally does happen, even if it's in a game. Reading back every response, it is undeniable that the more realistic something feels, the scarier it's going to be. That also includes more realistic themes, and not just the look of the game or the plot of the game. The likelihood of being told you need to be scared of something is going to change based on your gender, and therefore, naturally, the way that realism is interacting with your fear is going to change too. Everyone was terrified by the deep dark of the ocean, but it was never anyone's scariest game. The scariest game was always the game that made you feel connected to the character, made you feel fitted into their shoes, or only aware of what they're aware of. If it wasn't the integration into the character that made it scary, it was the character and story's integration into their own life, forcing them to contend with nightmares and themes of things that either could or has happened to them and those around them in the real world. So yeah, I think the conclusion we can come to is gender is absolutely going to play a role in what someone describes as scary, especially when you look at it under the realism multiplier. Whatever pulls that realism trigger is going to be different for different people, and some of those differences are going to be based on socialization of the genders. Is this some new insane conclusion that's blowing all our minds? Listen, I don't look down on my audience that much. I am sure you're all educated. It's more of an interesting and unique way to reach this conclusion. Well, originally I was trying to disprove it. It exercises the brain, and that's really what it's all about around here. I do think we can go deeper though, strip back the realism modifier and reveal the new idea, and make all of the video worthwhile. It comes to the second half of my thesis. I think we can concentrate down what is considered scary until we get to a point that makes a person's gender or life experience irrelevant. There were 5 question responses that posited, well, fear of certain things can be heightened by gender. They do think it has influence. They also think there's a kind of fear that will always transcend it, a kind of fear that the outlier described, an instant, animalistic fear. I like this concept, so let's use it to reopen the case and hunt for what I think might be the ultimate fear scenario. What is the scariest experience anybody could have, completely separate from their life experience? In the 5th question, being stalked or overpowered in real life were unanimously mentioned as examples of why women would find this type of enemy or encounter more terrifying in a game than a man would. The phrase walking alone at night was used in 4 out of 5 responses verbatim. But here's where it gets interesting. It wasn't actually the women who seemed most frightened by that stalker enemy. Being overpowered wasn't the scariest thing that they encountered in their game. Under the original framework the questions were presented to my collaborators, you'd think that out of these answers, the ones that reflected being followed or the other stereotypical girl horror elements would be mentioned the most by women and the least by men. But that wasn't the case. In fact, outside of that specific abstract daddy mention from BISCO, classic girl horror tropes were surprisingly not only mentioned more often, but focused on more clearly from the guys. Specifically, even the aforementioned stalker scenario. I could even go as far to point out Angela's specific trauma in Silent Hill 2 was described uncomfortable and scary to witness just the same by all the guys as it was by BISCO. When the women included in my questionnaire were describing what they felt was uniquely frightening to them, it was mostly niche stuff, subtle implications made by the game, expectations that were being put on them, roles in society reflected through themes of exploitation, and a lot of mentions of being diseased or unclean, both metaphorically and literally. That doesn't mean stalker types did not scare them, just that when describing themes outside of active in-moment threats, they weren't getting hung up on this theme like men did. Feeling powerless was a constant motif in men's writing. They regularly referenced back to someone or something that either was or could start following them or overpowering them when they described what was scary. But then, only the way a woman may be possibly more afraid of a stalker or attacker ever came up in people's answers. There was actually never a reason given why men could be more afraid of something than a woman would be. There were a few musings about how women are brought up to be more emotionally attuned to these types of scenarios, and therefore wouldn't need time to meditate on them and their implications to be immediately put off or afraid by them. If you read the answers with no other influence, though, it really does seem like it's only the guys that are super bothered by things happening in the moment. When having some conversations about results with few participants, I was really intrigued by the theories as to why this pattern emerged, despite what everyone originally assumed.
The final question, they circled back to women. But isn't that like kind of also, I guess, showing that fear of being powerless? It's like, well, I can't possibly admit that like that's the scariest thing. Even though it sounds like they have throughout their answers, they are so scared of the powerlessness, and they can identify that and talk about it in this questionnaire. But then maybe when push comes to shove, they're like, oh, no, women are, they're the ones that need the help. They're the ones that have the, the things to worry about, right? Mm-hmm. But like in reality, they just spoke about how like that feeling of being powerless, whether it's they're being followed and something's out of their control, because they have an expectation. Like society's also created that conditioning and social expectation that they're supposed to be strong and not have emotions and they don't cry and things like that. So my interpretation of that is that they kind of just leaned into that thing that they're scared of, the powerlessness, because it would be weak to say like being powerless is my biggest fear, or not having that control is super scary, and we should talk about that and acknowledge that as me, as a male.
Subconsciously, maybe. They're almost holding on to that expectation all the way to the end, where they're not reflecting on the fact that, oh, maybe I'm really, like, they just assume that if they're this scared of it, women must be this much more scared.
Yes, yeah. And I think, it's understandable because we're conditioned to think that women aren't strong, in that sense. But I think that, especially just going by what you sort of mentioned in terms of like the answers from the women are less about being like powerful and whatnot. It's more the sort of acceptance. That's the vibe I get.
No, I see that. Yeah, how I kind of saw it, and I wish I did have a higher sample size to be on after this, because this was probably the most interesting part to me, was just the lack of focus on things that would be considered like, oh, women would be scared of this. I kind of agree with you that maybe it's kind of the social conditioning where they just expect that same idea to be scarier for women because they believe that they're afraid of it happening for real all the time. Which is like, are we more scared of it, or are we just scared of it more often? What you were saying earlier made me think powerlessness is the
lack of control.
Yeah, the lack of control is the core fear. And I think, possibly women are afraid of it because they're told that this will happen to you. Whereas men are told this can't happen to you. It's not gonna happen, right? Like, you can't let this, if this happens to you, you've lost that trait of manliness. I really like how you said that because of the expectation that women would be more scared of it, they are kind of just assuming that they are. And if it is so scary for me, how terrifying must it be for them?
Yeah. I think it's also, we know, like, as women, we've been told our entire lives to be afraid of XYZ or be cautious of XYZ or whatever it is, and we've experienced it and we've lived it. Not to say that men or people that identify as male haven't, generally speaking, whether it is like a bit of denial from men being like, no, I'm fine, must protect the women, or it's, a bit of social conditioning in that regard. Or it's interesting that you say like women would be like, yeah, this thing is scary, but let's move on and talk about this other thing. It's almost like we've already accepted it.
Yeah, like
we know it's scary. Yeah,
I'm scared of it all the time. Like, it's not.
Yeah, there's no mystery behind it. We know what to look out for. We've lived that, and then maybe from a male's perspective, it's more like a little bit more of a question mark of like, oh, I can only imagine what that feels like, and therefore I can dwell on that and stipulate and think and like, like it can go in many different directions because they don't know, again, generally speaking, what it feels like.
They don't have the practice coping with it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like, oh, wow, that's horrible. It's almost like a little bit of like a horror story. Wow, that's horrible. Like, well, that thing happened to you, or you have to worry about walking alone at night. That's crazy. Like they can't fathom it in that way. And it's like, yeah, no, that's reality for us. So yes, it's scary when it comes up in like horror games or horror movies or like books or any sort of like media, but it's also like, you know, I deal with that. Like I've got plans to navigate around that. So sure, it's scary, but it's like, yeah. The thing that really caught me is like everybody hates being chased, and I think that's universal.
In your final question, the optional question, you said how male players might not consider the horror of a situation, that a female player might be able to parse through like any like subtle messages and like really understand it.
Right.
And what did, like, could you elaborate on kind of what you were saying there and how like a man would just write off something like that as par for the course?
So themes within horror often involve, well, it depends on the genre, but I think it's safe to generalize and say that there's often themes of emotional distress. There's often themes of extreme violence. I think that depending on the male we're talking about's background, they might write that kind of stuff off. This game is violent. I've come to this game expecting violence and emotional distress and all of these different things. Because I have this expectation, and because I don't necessarily have a highly attenuated empathy system within my psyche, I might write that off as par for the course within the context of the game that I'm playing. Whereas women, and again, this is gross generalization, you know, within the context of the question, I felt that generalization is all I could speak to, but women are more attenuated. They might not be significantly more attenuated, but they are more attenuated. A female playing a horror game might encounter situations where they can't help but feel more acutely about what is experienced within the game. It's not so much that, a man is incapable, a woman is more capable, one way or the other. It's just in general, when we are speaking in the context of a horror video game, or really just the horror genre in general, I felt that might be a safe statement to make.
Regardless of why it comes about, you think they would have stronger reaction to things?
It depends on what we're talking about, but yes.
Okay. Something everybody meant, and I mean everybody who got to that fifth question mentioned, was like women would be more afraid of a stalker because they have that threat in real life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that are being followed. So that was, the assumption everybody made. If you've been stalked, it doesn't matter what your gender is, like that could trigger that realism aspect and make it scarier. So like it's not that being a woman makes it scarier, it's the fact that you're told all the time in real life to be afraid of this, so it feels more real to you. And it's not necessarily that you are a woman, it's that you're kind of prepped to be afraid of this thing.
Interesting. I think that a good statement that I could make to that is women are almost taught that they're weaker in that situation. The power dynamic is skewed out of their favor, whereas a man may feel, doesn't matter, I can kick that person's ass, right? That might be a perceptual experience that speaks to power dynamic within thinking. So I did find that intriguing. What I latched onto specifically is your idea that certain persons will be almost prepped to be afraid based on their life experiences. And yes, that may include their gender, but it is not necessarily exclusively tied to it.
What I found really interesting, while women are afraid of the stalker enemy, it is not like the part of the game, but for men, almost every single one of them, a huge part was like being chased or feeling powerless, like one of those two things. When I get to the final question, everybody, including women, all said women would probably be more afraid of a stalker or an attacker. Nobody gave a reason why a man would be more frightened of anything than a woman would be. I thought that was crazy.
Why do you think men are afraid of feeling powerless?
So me and BISCO actually spent 30 minutes on this. Kind of what we kind of agreed on with what we said is, it's not that like men were more focused on this thing or like noticed it more or anything. anything like that, it is probably something to do with it is just not hitting the realism multiplier in the scary way. Like, I am scared of walking outside and being chased by a man in real life. So when it comes up in a video game, I am already emotionally prepared to cope with being chased. So when it happens in a game, it just doesn't stand out. Women are almost trained to expect this to happen to them, like it's going to happen to them, whereas men are almost told, like, this cannot happen to you. You know, it's not even like, oh, I never thought about it. It's just like, this isn't supposed to be this way.
A good way to put this is when you are accustomed and frankly trained by society to be the pursuer in all facets of your life. You are designated by society as the taker of action. So when you are put into a situation where you are not the choice maker, you are not the actor, you have no tools, you have no context, you simply must react to the circumstance that you are put into. The script has been flipped on you in a very, very big way. And that feeling elicits powerlessness. I think that makes the chase sequence that we're speaking to in this situation perhaps a little more poignant for men. I think that might not be the sole isolated factor that makes that particularly scary for male players. I think that there's something to it that I've just touched on there.
I think you're right. I was wondering, so when you said that men are seen as not being scared and being big and macho, and women are, are portrayed that way regularly, that's the impression people would have, but you personally don't agree with that. I did notice in my results that is exactly what happened.
When you constantly get exposed to these ideas that, one person is more scared of things than other people, or that things should be one way or another. Like in older movies, horror movies especially, there's usually the macho man, doing all these macho things and being strong and, brave and going through head to head with whatever the situation is. And I think enough of that can sort of convince someone that they have to be that way because they are the same gender of that person that was portrayed in all those movies. And that's also, to me, another way of saying, yes, it does matter. Absolutely matters. The gender, not at a very biological level. I think something that everyone can be scared of regardless, I feel, is the unknown. Anxiety, pretty much what causes that. No matter where you are in the world, everybody deals with it. And I think that's something that can scare everybody. Just the fear of not knowing what the situation is. So you have no idea how you would go about it. And then if you look at statistically at things that happen, horrible, frightening situations that I feel would statistically happen more often to a female gender than it would to a male, and then same with other situations, more often for a male than a female. So with all of that, it would, of course, make sense and it would absolutely carry some weight that there would be a situation, I feel, that more often than not a male would be scared in or a female would be scared in, and the other way around. There's also overlap. There are certain things that I think would be dealt with or felt by both genders in the same way.
I like your angle of it being a result of, coaching through media and stories from other people that you hear, that this is the thing that's scariest. And so when you're asked why would this be scarier for someone, you're going to assume, oh, this thing, because I hear about it all the time. But in the reality, because you're taught to think that way, it has the opposite effect of, I am afraid of men in real life. So I am always prepared to handle a situation where I'm chased or attacked or overpowered. But like you said, and kind of like what I kind of came to the conclusion of is, it's because you're unprepared for it that it is so frightening.
You're not really conditioned to think about it. That might bring more unknown into the situation. So
okay, I think that was kind of the thing. So the levels of fear being heightened or changed by the realism factor can work in the other direction, whereas someone is more afraid of something they haven't experienced or haven't had the chance to learn how to cope with or be prepared for. This is just an extra note that we really need to focus on peeling back the realism modifier to find the scariest possible thing, considering someone's realism modifier could be heightened or lowered if it's something that happened to them in real life or not. There is a surprising repeated phrase that I have yet to mention. BISCO described Silent Hill 2 in a way that feels like a purposeful exercise in confronting discomfort. This makes sense in a psychological horror game, especially one like Silent Hill, but I was even more surprised with it being repeated also by Dane, talking about Darkwood, who used the phrase putting you into your discomfort zone. I think this is a really good way to talk about horror, and across all answers, each game had at least one person mention in some way a feeling of discomfort. It either came from the story or the gameplay or the environment it all takes place in. They were feeling out of control, like they're responsible somehow for a misdeed, feeling like at any point the end could come without them knowing why or how. All of these things definitely fall into the category of uncomfortable, but being uncomfortable can't be the answer of what's the scariest thing for people, because obviously if you're afraid, you're going to feel uncomfortable. It's kind of a chicken or the egg and all that. Breaking all of this down and breaking down our conclusion on gender, the support of the new thesis kind of reveals itself. Men and women will give different reasons for the horror they feel, and it may very well depend on how they were socialized based on their gender. But in the end, all of the horror does stem from the same rudimentary aversions. Men wrote out powerlessness directly, but what is exploitation but taking power away from someone? Men described the guilt James carries in Silent Hill 2 being disturbing, uncomfortable, and a stain that couldn't be forgotten. Is guilt not a symptom of perceived moral uncleanliness? The soiling of your own conscience. With enough effort, you can boil down any of the listed fears by either party into the same cause of discomfort. And it seems that men and women were not getting different things out of this horror. So after all the analysis and all the comparison that we've done, we can use this way of thinking, this way of boiling down, to create a short list of things that manage to make a game or a situation scary at some point for every single person who I've questioned. The list I've come down to is someone or something you don't know the intentions of, not having a place to retreat to and feel safe in, not being able to see what's coming, well, knowing something is coming, and being pursued relentlessly. Let's think about that list. All of these answers are part of the same puzzle. You could put them all into one sentence. Being pursued relentlessly by something you can't see coming without knowing why and not having a place to hide from it. The alien, Nemesis, Mr. X, Abstract Daddy, the monolith controlling the necromorphs, a beast from beneath the water, a maniac with a saw in the basement, even the re-deads that freeze you and keep you from getting away when they attack. All of it. So, to give this video what I called some value to impart, to answer that added question that I wanted to uncover at the end, I've come to discover that the scariest thing any single person can experience, outside of gender, outside of background, a scenario you can insert into any setting, any time, any place, and any game, is the experience of being literally and figuratively followed in the dark.
Ew. Why are they humming at me? They're whistling in my ear!
Then if Oshiwo says, what have you been up to? Yeah, when I'm like, I'm depressed, they're gonna be like, are you sure? And just show them this.
Well, we're just gonna close that door and pretend like nothing happened. These guys in the living room are like, what was that? He's like, was that a gun?
Tastes like aristocracy.
Fucking son of a... We are back with another custom campaign breakdown. This time, we are going to be talking about the winner of the recent poll.
What was that movement? This? I don't know, I've been trying to make him look like he's gooning, okay?
Ooh, GG's, Jim. Heck yeah.
Oh God, I wasn't paying attention.
I was reading chat. No.
Okay. Hey, here's your next ingredient here. Where do you want me to put this? Right on the board? Nothing. Don't worry about it. This is helping in the kitchen.